Let's take a look at the other end of things that we can do with circle graphs. What we talked about in our last lesson was kind of how we create them and how we can, and what they are. And so today we're going to take a look at some conclusions that we can draw from them, as well as some predictions that we can make. So let's hop right into it. Circle graphs provide us with a lot of information. So what we can do is use this information to make some conclusions as well as some predictions, like I said. So let's take a look at this first example here. 60 students were surveyed about their favorite school subject. We don't know which students are, or how many students there were that preferred math versus reading or PE, social studies, or science. We just know the percents. 5% preferred math, 20% preferred reading. P.S. Boo, that only 5% preferred math. 35, no surprise, preferred PE compared to any of the other subjects. 10% for social studies, and then science at 30%. You will need a calculator for the next little bit of what we're doing, so if you do not currently have one, pause this and go grab one and then come back and we'll take a look. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to draw some conclusions based on this. We are going to do a little bit of work to figure out how many people actually prefer each of these. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to take a look at these questions. We're going to figure out some things about the information that we have available to us. And then we are going to make a prediction for what could happen. So, how many students like social studies best? Well, if you take a look, social studies, that's 10%. Okay, it tells us up here as well, 60 students were surveyed. So, of that 60 students, 10% like social studies best. The math that's going to help us out with this is this. It's really 60 times the percent right there. Now, I know what you may be asking yourself. Our calculators don't really have a percent button, or it's not super reliable. What in the world do we do with this? Well, there's a way that we can do this math without having to use percent or anything like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn that percent into a decimal. So we're still going to do 60 times something, but instead of 10%, it's going to be 10% as a decimal. And remember, going from a percent to a decimal, move the decimal 2 times to the left. So you get 0.1 or 0.10, whichever way you want to do it to keep track of it. But that's what you're going to do. This is what we're going to plug into the calculator. So go ahead and do 60 times 0.1 or 1/10. Put that into the calculator. Okay, remember this is just 10% as a decimal. When you do that, you find out 6. So our answer, how many students like social studies best? 6 of them. Okay, 6 out of those 60 like social studies best. So, taking a look at the next one, kind of using what we talked about here. Okay, just so we can visualize it, you can go ahead and write the percent straight up as a decimal if you would like to, but I'm going to keep showing you that just so we know what we're getting into and why we are doing what we're doing. Okay, so how many liked PE best? Well, PE is 35%. So it's 60 times 35%. And again, taking 35 and turning it into a decimal. So it's 60 times 0.35. All right, go ahead and plug that into the calculator and give it a quick check. All right. You should have gotten 21. So, how many students like PE best? Out of those 60, 21 prefer PE the best. On to the most depressing one, because this is the smallest amount. How many like math the best? This just kills me that these few students prefer math. But 5% prefer math the best. I'm going to do this one again, the converting, because I want you to see this. You may be very tempted to do 60 times 0.5, but remember 0.5 is 0.50, it's 50%. So taking 5 and turning it into a decimal. Remember that you don't see it, the decimal point's always at the end. Fraction to decimal is percent to decimal, 2 times to the left, and you get this nice little gap right here. Fill in the gap with a 0, and you get 0.05. So it's not 60 times 0.5, it's 60 times 0.05, 0.05. Run that math real quick. Make sure you plug it in and include this 0, because if you accidentally miss that in the calculator, you've done 0.5, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. And you would get an answer of 30 doing that. You don't want an answer of 30 because our biggest amount here is less than 30. That should be an automatic clue to you. So go ahead and make sure you get that 0 in there. Multiply it. Get an answer of 3. Another way you can figure that out. 10% is 6. 5% is half of 10%. Half of 6 is 3. Multiple ways to get these answers. Multiple ways to figure this out. But that's just one method there that you could use. I'm still going to show you this all the way through just so you can see these problems on their own. Because there's not always going to be the opportunity to see, 10% and then later 5%. You may be asked just to do 5%. All right, taking a look at reading. 20% prefer reading, so it's 60 times 20%, which as a decimal is 60 times 0.2. And I'm just going to leave it as 2/10 instead of putting the 0 in there just so you see that, because that's what it's going to become there. All right, 60 multiply it by 2/10. Go ahead and do that. Figure out the answer. Answer is 12. And again, you can relate it back to this. 10% 6, 20% is double that, so double 6 is 12. But either way you slice it, 12 students prefer reading. All right, this next question's a little bit different. Okay, this is still making some conclusions because what it's asking us is how many more students like science over reading. So what you end up having to do here is you need to take how many prefer science and then subtract how many prefer reading. So it's science minus reading. Okay, and what we can do is we can take a look. Okay, I have social studies, PE, math. Oh, I've got reading right here. That's 12, so it's minus 12. However, I don't have anything for science yet, so we need to go ahead and calculate that. So 60 times science being 30%. And let's go ahead and do that math. So 30% is a decimal, 0.3. And 60 times 0.3, plug that in the calculator. You get 18. That 18 represents science. So I'm going to plug that in over here. And we're going to do 18 minus 12. Go ahead and do that math. That math answer is going to plug in right there. So I'm just going to write it one time for the sake of space. 18 minus 12 gives us 6. So there are 6 more students that like science over reading. All right. What we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at the last question on here. You're going to take a little 1 or 2 minute brain break, and then we have one more example that we're going to take a look at, and then we're done with today's notes. All right, if 4 students who said they like PE switch their minds and say they like social studies best, because why wouldn't you? Social studies is awesome. What percent of students like social studies the best? We'll come back up here to this question. Okay, social studies, we had 6 students that liked social studies. So we're going to go old to new. Okay, the old was we had 6 students, and we're saying that 4 students are switching their mind. So that's going to be those original 6 students plus 4 more gives us 10 students that like social studies the best. It's not how many like it the best, it's what's the percent that like it the best. Well, let's stop and let's pause real quick. Originally, we had 60 students that were surveyed. This question right here, making this prediction, if 4 students switch their minds. Switching your mind does not mean you get a brand new student who's interviewed. You are taking the exact same sample size of 60 students, but 4 of them are changing their minds. So the amount of students that are surveyed is still 60. So to figure out the percent of this, you're going to take social studies and divide it by the total amount of students. The reason that we're going to do this, if I take 10 students and divide it by 60, that is going to give me the decimal amount of how many prefer social studies. Okay, and then when you abbreviate the word amount, it's AMT. Okay, that gives me the decimal amount that prefer social studies. 10 divided by 60. Plug that into your calculator, you get an answer of 0.16 with the 6 repeating. What you then do from there, and only because I have a lot of periods in here, I'm using the x to multiply. You're going to multiply your answer by 100, and that will give you the percent. Because remember, percents are always out of 100. So 0.16 with the 6 repeating times 100 simply moves your decimal point 2 places to the right to turn it from a decimal into a percent. You get 16 point, and remember, it's not a 0 over here because of that thing there. It's a 6 over here, and it's still repeating. So it's now 16.6, and we said it's percent, so it's now percent. So we went from 10% that said they like social studies best, now to 16.6 repeating percent. All right, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go ahead and take a quick break to give yourself a chance to kind of refresh. Go grab something to drink, something to eat, and then come back and we will take a look at example number 2. So go ahead and pause this, and then when you are ready, come back and let's take a look at number 2. All right, hopefully you enjoyed your break. Let's take a look at example 2, and then we'll call it good on today's notes. All right, we're going to take a look at Jane's budget. She earns $2,000 a month, and here's her monthly budget. So all of this right here is $2,000. And it's broken up into the categories: rent, 50%, food, 20%, entertainment is 10%, other, which just means whatever else she's spending her money on, 5%, and clothing, 15%. Maybe she likes to go to TJ Maxx, find whatever sales they have, whatever little tchotchkes for her house, something on the mantle. I don't know, but that 5%'s right there. All right, so let's take a look at some information about Jane and where her money's going. Okay, and then we'll take a look at making some predictions as well. All right, she is having to pay rent each month in order to live, because that's what you need to do. You need to have a place to live. So her rent is 50% of her budget. So her monthly budget is $2,000. And I'm not going to do the times 50% like we did. I'm just going to straight up go to the decimal because we spent the whole last page doing it. So 50% as a decimal is 0.5. And I'll include the 0 just so you can see that it's 50 right there. All right, so 50% of the budget, plug that into the calculator, 2,000 times 50% or half, or just think about what's half of 2,000. Well, that's 1,000. Now we're talking budget, we're talking money, so our answer needs to include a dollar sign. She spends $1,000 a month on her rent. All right, let's take a look at food. So food is 20% of her budget. So we're going to, again, take that $2,000 and multiply it by 20% as a decimal is 0.2. Go ahead, plug that into your calculator, see once what you get out of it. If you do it correctly, you will figure out that 20% of 2,000 is 400. So again, dollar sign for our answer. She's spending $400 a month on food. All right, what fraction of her money is spent on clothing and entertainment? Couple important things here. Fraction and the word and. We are not going to be figuring out the actual amount of clothing and entertainment right now. We're going to figure out what fraction of it is. So if we're taking a look at this, we're talking about this slice and this slice. What fraction of the entire circle graph are those two things? So what we're going to do is this. We're going to start out with figuring out the percents that she's spending here. Clothing is 10%. And because of the word and, we're going to add these together. And entertainment is, entertainment's 10%. Clothing was 15%. Rather than rewrite it, I'm just simply going to do it this way. My bad for going backwards on those. Okay. Clothing, 15%. Entertainment, 10%. Did it backwards. All good. We can do that in math. 10% and 15% when added together are 25%. Now, we're going to turn the percent into a fraction. If you remember the last lesson, we set up the circle graphs and we had those in there for us to help us out. But we're going to do this step by step. 25% going from a percent to a decimal to a fraction is 0.25. Okay. Then we say it, write it, and then simplify it. So that's 2500. So it's 25 over 100. And then we simplify 25 over 100. Well, that's a quarter or 1/4. So it is 1/4. So what fraction of her money is spent? Well, that's 1/4 of her money is spent on clothing and entertainment. All right. What is her largest expense? Well, her largest expense is what's taking up the most room in the budget. So take a look real quick. What's taking up the most room in the budget? Well, it's this big chunk right here, also known as rent. So her biggest expense is rent. It's not on here, but what is her second biggest expense? Okay, 50% here. What's the next biggest number you see? 20%. So food is her second biggest expense, which is honestly to be expected. Where you live and making sure that you can keep living by eating should be the two biggest expenses. All right, take a look, figure out what is her smallest expense. Well, her smallest expense is going to be the smallest percentage. Our smallest percentage that we have here is other, which is at 5%. So the random stuff she's spending her money on, that is her smallest expense. Let's take a look at this. How much more money does she spend on food than she spends on clothing? Well, we already know how much she spends on food, which is $400, but we don't yet know clothing because the only time we talked about clothing was here when we talked about the fractions. So let's figure out clothing real quick. Clothing is 15%, so we're going to take 2,000 times 15% as a decimal, which is 0.15. And this will help us figure out clothing. Do that math real quick and figure out what clothing is. If you figure that out, clothing is going to be 300. And then what we need to do to solve this is we need to figure out how much more does she spend on food than clothing. Well, that's going to be food minus clothing. Value for food is 400. Sub in the value. Subtract the value of clothing, which is 300. And 400 minus 300, quick, simple math, is 100. Add the dollar sign for your answer. She spends $100 more on food each month than she does on clothing. All right, we have one last question. This is a prediction question. If she increases her food budget by $100, what percent of her budget now goes towards food? Well, let's start just like we did with the last one. We're going from old to new. Okay, her old amount, she spends $400. And we're adding 100, which gives us a new amount of 500. And just like we did with the last problem, I'm not going to write all that stuff out again, but just like we did with the last example, we're going to take the new amount and we are going to divide it by her total budget. Budget is not changing, but how much she's spending on food is. So we're going to do 500 divided by 2,000. We're going to get the decimal 0.25. When you move that decimal point over twice to turn it from a decimal to a percent, you're going to find out that percent is 25%. So she'll be spending a quarter of her budget on food if she increases it by $100. So 25%. All right, here's your task. Make sure you understand this stuff. If you are stuck on this, go back and rewatch anything. Make sure that you come to class with any questions you might have, and we'll chat about this stuff together. See you then.